So, Jack's a part of it, I'm a part of it, Andalib's a part of it, Mickey's a part of it, Celeste is a part of it. We're all a part of it. We're all part, not of TEDx, but we're all a part of humanity. And when we think of humanity, we need to think of planet Earth. We need to think the whole of planet Earth, because in this whole planet, we've done many things. We've got economic systems, we've got political systems, education systems, we've got business systems, all built up with the sole purpose, with the sole logic. The only point of an economic system, in fact, is that it increases the well-being of humans, and the majority of humans, meaning of humanity. So that's the theory. The only logic for any system is that it increases the well-being, and that is a justification of all these systems. And we can only think of these systems when we think in terms of the 7 billion people who live on this planet. The 7 billion people here forming the mass of humanity, which is driving us forward. Now, I claim that we can think, rather than think of 7 billion people, we can think of 7 billion brains, because ultimately it's brains in those 7 billion people which are making decisions every single day, thinking opinions, forming circuits, and driving all the systems that drive all of us forward. Then I make another bold claim that if we just look at one brain, not any particular brain, I wouldn't say my particular brain or my brain or your brain, but a brain on average, we should find the answers, the solutions to what humanity is about. And the best place to start probably is not this particular brain, but if we go to a little baby's brain. You're cute, isn't it? I've got another picture of a Snuggy Wuggy baby a little bit later, yeah. So we need to look at babies' brains, and I'm not going to talk today about the whole evolution of brains. There's fantastic, interesting things. We can talk about neuronal migrations in the womb as the neurons spread out and start connecting together, how the neurons start to connect and link, how they keep growing all your life right into an old age, how we have dendritic spikes which just spike out, and they can spike out in a number of minutes. From the start to the end of this talk, you may have more dendritic spikes in your brain, which means your brain will have grown a microscopic amount. But I want to think more of in terms of the brain, the evolution, and what's actually in it that drives us. Now let's take a step back right to the beginnings, and that's how you started, day one here. If we look at day 18, you can already see there's a start of a spinal cord. It's just a groove, but at day 18, as a microscopic little thing, it's already getting ready for a nervous system. Day 28, we're already up there, 24, brain already starting to develop. And we can look at that now with modern technology. That's why neuroscience has made huge leaps in recent years. You can see the little stages of the brain growing and growing and growing and growing. And if we looked at it like this, which is a better representation, we can start to understand some of the important things in the brain. Now, there's a theory which is ontogeny follows phylogeny, replicates phylogeny, which is a complicated way of saying that actually the evolution of a single organism, of a single brain, particularly the human brain, represents the evolution of all species. Now, in biology, it's a little bit of a side note because the complication of all those different species is not so simple, but there's some dramatic parallels at the same time. So simple, very simple brains do look at this. This would be the size of a pinprick, remember. They do look at this like that, and they grow, and more things start getting added to it. But we notice that this part of the brain stem, sitting back here, is the very first thing to develop, logically, of course, because that is the living part of the brain. That's a part of the brain that controls your breathing, your heartbeat, your body temperature, and all your instinctive reactions. That's the first thing to grow. And the more advanced the being, obviously, the more advanced the brain. And when we come up to here, we see striking similarities between, say, monkeys' brains and then ending up at this hugely complex 85 billion neurons with 85 billion glial cells connecting it, which is the human brain. What we do know about this theory is that certainly as a baby, a recent piece of research in 2010 showed that we know the brain grows bottom to top, as we saw in the previous picture, and it grows back to front. And that does represent at least recent evolution in human history. And we can see this happening in a baby, developing bottom-to-top survival instincts, going upwards, back to front. For example, language comprehension sits back here, speaking sits there. Babies can understand before they can speak. The right hemisphere develops before the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere in speech controls intonation. And babies are very good at intonation. You know, go, 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 go. And the mommy goes, putty, 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 putty. And they're speaking in levels of intonation because babies understand intonation, but they don't understand words, which sits right at the front of the brain and comes last. That front part of the brain develops last. And it doesn't fully develop actually till you're in your early 20s. And that part of the brain is part of the brain that controls executive functions, controlling things like emotions, which is also why teenagers don't have quite as much emotional control as most parents would like them to have. So we can see that with the brain, it develops up in this direction. We've got all the biology, all these neurons, massive neurons. We've got this brain stem down here, core nature, controlling instinctive living instincts. We've got this big bit here called scope, the emotional center, and it comes out to this area here. And we've got this little bit at the front, which we can call the cognitive functional. COF stands for cognitive functional area. Cognitive functional part of the brain. We notice, though, that the brain operates bottom to top, not top to bottom. That means this takes priority over that, over that. If we think of living instincts, something as simple as eating. How on earth does the body know how to eat? We say it's instinctive. Yes, it's instinctive. There's an emotional construct that sits here. Feeling hungry feels bad. Eating feels good. So even the instinctive emotions lie on emotional constructs, and emotional constructs feed the chemicals that allow the brain cells to communicate to each other. This front bit of the brain, that's the bit, of course, that does all the planning, all the analysis, does the computers, the beamers, builds the buildings, builds the bridges, and we think, or we used to think in our arrogance, that was the most powerful part of the brain. It's not. Sorry to tell you, for those who haven't heard me speak before, it is not. It's confused very easily, shuts down very easily, and actually I'll confuse your prefrontal cortex right now, very simply. I'll give you a very simple task first. I want you to count upwards in steps of 2. 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay? Okay, ready, steady, go. 2. Great, you're really good, you're smart. You're really smart. Good, go. Okay, right. Simple, you did that, no problems. Let's just make it a little bit more difficult. And I want you to count upwards in steps of 13. Okay. Steps of 13, okay? Starting 13, 26, 39, that's the first 3 already, okay. Ready, steady, go. 30. Come on, guys. Rami's still going, Rami's still... Okay, I was going to do another task, but you're obviously not up to it. You notice, on the big scale of things, counting upwards in steps of 13 is really not very complicated, is it? And already then, the prefrontal cortex has gone, started to shut down. Prefrontal cortex will shut down very quickly. We overestimate its power and underestimate this part of the brain. Now, you may wonder what SCOPE actually stands for. Now, SCOPE was first proposed in some form. I developed it in my last book with Professor Theo Peters. Was first proposed by a guy called Professor Klaus Grover at Zurich University, drawing on a lot of research. He was researching the brain and psychotherapy. And he came to say that these 5 things are at the heart of all human beings. They drive all human beings in motivation cycles. If they're violated, there'll be disruption. If these are disrupted, there'll be psychological sickness. And those 5 things then define human beings. 5 things are what we always drive for, and all human systems will drive for these 5 things. S stands for self-esteem, which includes things like identity, self-identity. Klaus will be speaking afterwards about self-identity. Control, which includes things like the huge things like freedom and autonomy. And David and Daniela will also be talking about the power of freedom a little bit later. We can talk about orientation. Things like Isabel speaking about back to the roots, understanding your roots. That's all about orientation. We can talk about attachment, which are relationships. Relationships are what actually make it somehow more fun to come to TEDx live than to sit home alone and watch the video yourself. It's just because we're so intrinsically built into relationships. And of course, pleasure. We like to have a bit more fun than a bit more pain, obviously. I want to draw just one of these out, and that's attachment. I want to think a little bit more about what attachment means in the brain and how this ties into this whole big concept of humanity. And when we think of attachments, we actually have to think of, technically speaking, it's attachment and bonding. So it's about how we bond, how we connect, how we build relationships together. That's the other cute baby picture. Because if we think about it, I showed you the pictures of the embryo growing. Attachment, babies grow, they are attached. They spend 9 months attached, where the brain is already very active and very forming. Childbirth is stimulated by a release, labor is stimulated by a release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is considered the attachment neuromodulator in the brain, a chemical. Many chemicals in the brain do many things, as does oxytocin, but we know it's released strongly in childbirth. The first suckling of breast milk gives a giant boost of oxytocin to baby and mother and generates these reciprocal feelings of love and bonding and tenderness. We know that if you give oxytocin to adults, you increase trusting behavior, you increase friendly behavior, and women will be happy to know giving oxytocin to men makes them more cuddly. Now, attachment theory started back many years ago. The first interesting one, I'll come back to this little example in a few moments. A guy called Howard Skeels, a psychologist, took on a post at an orphanage. And when he first walked into the orphanage, before it's actually started work, this was an Iowa State orphanage in the US. This was before the First World War in the 1930s. Huge orphanages, very bad conditions, didn't have a lot of resources. And in that orphanage, there were 2 young girls, about 18 months old. Described them as whiny, cry, snivelly, emaciated. They had no response, they had very little muscular tone, unresponsive. Even their whole look, they described the hair as being thin. And there was a problem. Basically, they thought, okay, these kids are probably not going to be adopted. They had limited resources, they had no space in the orphanage. So they did something which sounds actually quite shocking, is they moved them out, and this was on the ground of a mental hospital as well. So they moved these 2 little girls, 18 months old, considered mentally retarded, thought no hope of adoption, and moved them into a ward with a group of retarded and mentally sick, not severely mentally sick, but basically retarded, or what they classed as retarded at the time, retarded women between the ages of 18 and 50. I'll come back to the story in a few moments. I'll explain a little bit more about the science. Keep you in suspense. You can just think, what do you think happened? It sounds like a shocking story. Attachment theory itself developed in 1950 with John Bowlby. And he wrote a report, 44 delinquent thieves. And he noticed these thieves, these delinquents, these juvenile delinquents, a large majority of them had faulty attachment behaviors, had very bad family backgrounds, and he proposed this theory. He did a piece of research for the United Nations in 1951 and proposed this theory of attachment, that attachment is important for mental health. This was followed by a guy called Harry Harlow, who did a whole series of famous and infamous experiments with monkeys. And these showed, for example, they'll take a monkey just away from its mother and just bring it up without its mother. They'll keep it in solitary confinement. And these monkeys, these little baby monkeys, developed massively distorted behaviors. Some of them represented a human being sitting in the corner, rocking, not being able to put them back in the troop, and they had no social skills, couldn't socialize, had disruptive behavior. And that's the root of attachment theory. We now know, with the science, some very interesting things. We now know, for example, that rat pups who are licked and cuddled more often by their mothers develop stronger neuronal connections. We know in troops of monkeys that even genetically inferior monkeys who are given to supermothers who are particularly caring will become superior in that monkey troop. In that context, nurture beats nature. The more interesting studies in this are that we know that that is a normal neuron, normal connections. That is the neuron of a rat pup that's been taken away from its mother. Being taken away from your mother creates what we call toxic stress and will actually destroy neurons. It will actually destroy the architecture of the brain. It will change the architecture of your brain. So what do we think happened to those two girls in that orphanage? Two girls taken away. He came back 6 months later, walked past two girls playing outside happily, walked into the ward and asked where the girls were. They said they were outside playing. He went outside and hadn't recognized two friendly, intelligent, intelligence is not quite the right word, children playing outside had become completely normal children. Their IQ had jumped back almost to normal. Why? Because they'd been in an environment where they'd had love, and in these wards, an older lady had taken on the role of a mother, and all the other women had given them attention and love and care, and in 6 months' time, they jumped back almost to normal behavior, just because of love. Now, when we look at happiness studies, we also see a very similar thing. Happiness, all these studies, is more a representation of the breadth and depth of your relationships than anything else. Wealth does not play a big part in being happy. Economic systems I've spoken about. We talk about economic systems serving humanity. That means actually creating greater well-being and greater happiness, yet we know the thing that creates most happiness are the breadth and depth of your relationships. So that brings me back to the start then, because if we're thinking of humanity, we have to think in terms of attachment and bonding. We have to think in terms of what is driving the planet. We have to think of what are these systems doing. If we have a system for the planet that doesn't include that, we don't have a sustainable system. If we have an economic system which increases wealth and decreases love, we actually have a dysfunctional system. If it increases wealth, increasing love, it's in status quo. If we increase wealth and increase love even more, we have a better system for humanity. So looking into the brain, we can see actually very, very clearly the core constructs in the brain, how the brain is wired and how the brain connects and what makes it healthy and what makes behaviors and what drives intelligence. It's driven by love. And if systems, economic systems, corporate systems, political systems, education systems do not take into account, they'll be dysfunctional. What we know from the brain is very simple, as the Beatles said, all you need is love. Thank you.